Picture one of Annie Oakley's exhibitions. Before a packed crowd under banners, a man steps forward with a cigarette clenched between his lips. He doesn't flinch. He trusts her completely. 30 paces away, Annie lifts her rifle. In one of the trick shots for which she became famous, she could aim backward using a small hand mirror, relying on reflection and muscle memory alone. The crowd goes still, the kind of stillness that settles over a room right before something either goes gloriously right or terribly wrong. And somewhere in that silence is a skill she built years earlier, in a much colder, much lonelier place, aiming at supper instead of showmanship. We'll come back to the cigarette stunt, because to understand how she got there, and the royal figure who later asked to take part in it, we have to go back to the beginning. On this day, August 13, 1860, in a small log cabin in Darke County, Ohio, a girl was born who the world would come to know by a name she invented for herself. Her parents called her Phoebe Ann Mosey. Nobody in that cabin, wrapped in whatever blankets a poor frontier family could spare, could have guessed she'd one day perform for kings, kaisers, and a queen. But first, life handed her a childhood that was anything but glamorous. A childhood spent far from ballrooms and stages, in the kind of rural hardship that shaped so many Americans of that era. Her family was poor even by frontier standards, and things got harder fast. When Phoebe Ann was still a small child, her father, Jacob, got caught in a brutal snowstorm on his way home, the kind of sudden, punishing weather that frontier families lived in fear of every winter. He survived the storm itself, made it home alive, but the exposure broke his health in ways that wouldn't show themselves all at once. He never fully recovered, and he died not long after. For the family left behind, his death meant more than grief. It meant the loss of their provider, in a household that already had little to spare and now had even less. What followed was a stretch of real hardship, the kind that doesn't make it into the glittering later chapters of a legend but shapes them all the same. For a time, young Phoebe Ann was sent to the Darke County Infirmary, what people of that era plainly called the Poorhouse, a place built for exactly the kind of family crisis hers had become. Later, by her own account, she was placed with a family, people she would only ever describe, pointedly, as the wolves, who she said worked her hard and treated her cruelly. It's a rough chapter, and we don't need to dwell on it to feel the weight of it, the image alone. A child given a name like that for the people meant to care for her says enough. What matters is this: somewhere in the middle of that hardship, a girl who had every reason to be broken by circumstance instead started teaching herself something that would change everything. Back home again with her mother and siblings, still just a kid, Phoebe Ann picked up her late father's old rifle, heavier, probably, than she was built to carry with any ease. Nobody trained her. No coach, no academy, no mentor at her shoulder correcting her stance, no one to tell her how to breathe or how to hold steady. She simply went out into the woods and fields around Darke County and taught herself to shoot, out of necessity as much as curiosity, learning by trial and by hunger. Small game, squirrels, rabbits, quail became both dinner and income. She got so good, so quickly, that she wasn't just feeding her own family anymore. She began selling game to local shopkeepers and hotels, and by most accounts, the money she brought in helped pay off the mortgage on her mother's home. Picture that for a moment. A girl not yet in her teens, alone in the woods at dawn, breath fogging in the cold Ohio air, essentially becoming the family breadwinner with nothing but a rifle and dead-on instinct. No fanfare, no audience, just quiet, steady competence built one shot at a time. Word travels fast in small communities, and word about the Mosey girl's aim traveled faster than most. By her mid-teens, she had a local reputation as somebody who flat-out did not miss, the kind of reputation that starts as a rumor and ends up being repeated as simple fact. That reputation eventually reached a man who made his living as a professional marksman. His name was Frank Butler. As the traditional account goes, he arrived in the area expecting another easy win in a match against a local shooter. He did not get one. According to the long-told version, around Thanksgiving of 1875, Frank Butler found himself in a shooting match against a teenage girl from Darke County and lost when she hit every target, and he missed one. Modern researchers have questioned whether the match actually took place several years later, but the result is not in doubt. Annie beat him. It's the kind of upset that could have humiliated a professional, the sort of loss a man in his line of work might rather forget. Instead, something more interesting happened. Butler was impressed. Genuinely, thoroughly impressed. The two struck up a friendship that turned into something more. They later said they had married in 1876, though their surviving marriage certificate is dated June 20, 1882. Frank became her husband, her manager, her promoter, and eventually her stage partner, the man who spent the rest of his life helping the world see what he'd witnessed on that Ohio shooting ground. She took a stage name for herself, Annie Oakley. In 1885, Annie and Frank joined the biggest traveling spectacle in the world, Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West Show, a sprawling touring production that brought the imagery of the American frontier to audiences hungry for it. Small in stature but towering in skill, Annie Oakley became one of its brightest stars. Renowned as one of the finest sharpshooters of her era, she outshot seasoned marksmen and made it look almost effortless, as if the rifle were simply an extension of her own hand. Sitting Bull, the great Lakota leader, is said to have been so taken with her after meeting her in 1884 that he symbolically adopted her, giving her the name Watanya Cecilia, rendered in show publicity as Little Sure Shot, a nickname that stuck with her for the rest of her life and traveled with her wherever she went. And travel she did. Starting in 1887, Buffalo Bill's Wild West sailed for Europe, and Annie Oakley became something audiences overseas had never quite seen. An American woman who commanded a stage entirely on her own talent, with no title and no inherited name to lean on. She performed for Queen Victoria during her Golden Jubilee celebrations that same year, and the show kept touring the continent for royalty and commoners alike, crowd after crowd, city after city, cementing her as one of America's first great female celebrities, a genuine superstar before the word even existed in that sense. It was during a European engagement in Berlin in 1890 that Annie performed before German royalty, including the young future Kaiser Wilhelm Roman II. And so, the story goes that Wilhelm had seen Annie shoot a cigarette from Frank Butler's mouth and wanted the stunt repeated. Annie wisely had him hold the cigarette in his hand instead. As the story goes, she didn't hesitate and she didn't miss. She shot the ash from its tip, Wilhelm unharmed, and the crowd roared, the tension breaking into applause. The exact tale is disputed. Annie reportedly denied it before she and Frank later embraced it during World War I, but it's been told and retold for more than a century. A strange, almost funny footnote of history, and one more moment in the legend of a woman who seemed never to meet a target she couldn't hit. Annie Oakley kept performing for decades, kept inspiring generations of Americans, especially women, to pick up a rifle and believe they belonged on that field too, standing shoulder to shoulder with anyone who doubted them. She proved that talent built in hardship, sharpened through hunger and grit rather than privilege, could still rise to the biggest stages on earth, from a poorhouse in Dark County to the courts of European royalty. So today, on August 13th, the anniversary of her birth in that small Ohio cabin back in 1860, it's worth remembering her not just as a sharpshooter, but as proof of something distinctly, proudly American. That where you start doesn't have to determine how far you go.